The Roman Empire was an empire of many religions because it had conquered so many territories. Whenever a new tribe, a new territory was conquered by the Roman armies, new gods, new ways of worship were brought into Roman life. And the Romans were fine about that, provided that these new religions did not cause civil unrest, provided that these new peoples were happy from time to sacrifice to the Roman emperor, to accept Roman statues in their places of worship. Then why not add other gods to the diverse number of gods that the Romans already worshipped? There was one group of people for whom this did not apply, and that was the Jews. The Jews were a troublesome people in Romans' eyes. They insisted on worshipping only one god, which, as far as a Roman was concerned, was tantamount to atheism. They would not allow any statues or images to be put up in their temple or in their synagogues. But because the Jews were an ancient people, their religion was recognized to be an ancient religion, they were granted certain privileges and exemptions by the Romans. They didn't have to sacrifice to the emperor. And for the first decades of the Christian faith, Christians were seen by the Romans as simply another branch of Judaism. So they lived under the Jewish umbrella, if you like. They were not singled out as particularly strange or new or weird. And so the first persecutions that we hear of are not state-sanctioned persecutions. We do get an intriguing little glimpse of Roman, Jewish and Christian relations in our Bible. In Acts chapter 18, Luke writes, "After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome." Why did Claudius order all the Jews to leave Rome? Well, writing sometime later, the Roman historian Suetonius, in his Life of Claudius, writes that Claudius ordered all the Jews to leave Rome because there was trouble at the instigation of someone called Chrestus. Suetonius obviously thinks that Chrestus is a troublemaker, a rabble-rouser. But it's more likely that actually Chrestus should be read Christus. There's been trouble in Rome between the Jews because of Christ. And from what we know of those early Jewish-Christian relations, it's quite likely that there were Jewish Christians in Rome who were proclaiming Jesus as Lord. The non-Christian Jews obviously didn't accept that. There was some unrest. And Claudius, as far as he was concerned, seeing this as an internal Jewish matter, simply expels them all from Rome. But as time went on, the two religions become more distinct, and Christianity moves away from that special protection conferred upon the Jews and is begun to be seen by the Romans as a menace. The Christians would not sacrifice to the emperor, but they were not given the exemptions that the Jews were. Persecution of Christians, we know from the Bible, was there from the start. We read it in Acts, but that persecution is mostly local and prompted by crowd displeasure at the apostles' teaching. It was closer to mob lynching than judicial punishment. Christians were not persecuted all the time. There were lengthy periods when the church enjoyed peace and Christian communities developed in Roman cities without, it appears, any great problem. But when persecution did break out, it could be extreme. The book of Revelation was probably written during the time of the Emperor Domitian's persecution in the 90s and gives a flavour of the pain felt by the church. Another intriguing glimpse that we get of Christian-Jewish relations comes from the writings of Pliny the Younger. Pliny was an administrator, a local governor, and he had been sent by the Emperor Trajan to Bithynia, which is in northern Turkey. And when he's there, he comes across all sorts of bureaucratic problems that he writes to Trajan about. Most of these are about sewers, building bridges. the difficulty in getting money and expertise out of Rome to the provinces so they can get their roads sorted, all the sort of things that actually local governors and councils complain about today. But about 112 AD, Pliny writes a letter puzzled because he's come across some people called Christians and is not really sure what to do about them. I asked them whether they were Christians, and if they confessed, I asked them a second and third time with threats of punishment. If they kept to it, I ordered them for execution, for I held no question that whatever it was they admitted, in any case, obstinacy and unbending perversity deserved to be punished. There were others of the like insanity, but as these were Roman citizens, I noted them down to be sent to Rome. They maintained, however, that the amount of their fault or error had been this, that it was their habit on a fixed day to assemble before daylight and recite by turns a form of words to Christ as a God, and that they bound themselves with an oath not for any crime, but not to commit theft or robbery or adultery, not to break their word, and not to deny a deposit when demanded. After this was done, their custom was to depart, and to meet again to take food, but ordinary and harmless food. And even this, they said, they had given up doing after the issue of my edict, by which, in accordance with your commands, I had forbidden the existence of clubs. One of the earliest examples we have of Christian persecution, but also one of the earliest examples we have of Christ being worshipped as a God. A very interesting letter. Well, it was against this background of accusations, often outlandish accusations of cannibalism and incestuous orgies and atheism, that writers like Justin Martyr tried to justify Christianity as compatible with being a good Roman citizen. Yet the church continued to grow. The North African writer Tertullian said, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." And as the church grew, so persecution grew more intense, until under the Emperor Diocletian at the beginning of the 4th century, entire Christian settlements were destroyed, with thousands upon thousands killed. And yet, within 8 years of the Great Persecution, as it became known, Christianity was secured at the heart of the empire. So what happened to change everything? Well, the story goes something like this. The 3rd century saw political chaos in the Roman Empire, with a succession of emperors being assassinated. Diocletian, for all his faults when it came to persecuting Christians, was a very able administrator, and he saw the problem and wanted to provide stable rule. So he divided the empire into half, with 2 emperors, one looking after the west, one looking after the east. And then deputy emperors called Caesars, who were basically the ones who had been groomed to take over. And the idea was that instead of just having the sons of emperors taking over, which hadn't proved very successful in the past, men of quality would be raised up to become the new emperors. The problem is that didn't really work very well with the sons of the emperors, who felt that it was their divine right to become emperors. And so almost as soon as this idea was put into practice, chaos breaks out once more. One of the sons of those emperors was a man called Constantine, who was at that moment fighting on the very fringes of the empire up on Hadrian's Wall. On his father's death, who was emperor, he was acclaimed emperor and set out for Rome to claim his right and fight Maxentius, the son of the other emperor. And these 2 armies met on the Milvian Bridge outside of Rome. And before the battle, Constantine had a vision from heaven, and he saw in the heavens a cross-shaped trophy with the words, "By this sign you shall conquer." And Constantine made a banner of that cross, took it into war, and duly won the battle. And on becoming emperor, he immediately cancelled all persecution against the Christians, and in the Edict of Milan granted freedom of religion for all, restoring all stolen property to its Christian owners. Just like that, the Roman Empire becomes Christian. But is the story as straightforward as that? Well, it's a bit more complex. Despite the persecutions, Christianity was already a 300-year-old religion and had changed a lot during that time. It was no longer the religion only of slaves and workers. Respectable middle classes also had converted. There had been churches built in many of the Roman cities, and some cities already had a very sizable population of Christians. And there was, as well as a political crisis, an ongoing spiritual crisis in the Roman Empire. The chaos of the 3rd century seemed to show to some that the old pagan gods had failed. They hadn't protected Rome. We know even from the Gospels that there were many Romans attracted to Judaism because of its antiquity and because of its theological underpinnings. And this had become also true of Christianity, along with other new mystery religions such as Mithraism that had sprung up. Christians had also won many converts by their examples of martyrdom, by looking after abandoned children, and by caring for the sick in times of plague. These were not typical Roman virtues, and so the Christians became noticed, and people were attracted to them. So Constantine's conversion to this religion was not completely left field. And some people have doubted whether Constantine ever converted anyway. He was, after all, only baptized on his deathbed. Some point out that Constantine was already known as somebody who worshipped the unconquerable sun and Apollo, and so following Jesus didn't entail much more than a change of name. Perhaps Constantine saw the opportunity to latch on to this popular and growing religion without having to do too many spiritual acrobatics. The answer is we don't know. We don't know what Constantine's spiritual life was like. But we do know what the impact of his conversion, if it was that, had on the church. One of the first acts of Constantine was to move out of Rome and to build a new city in the old town of Byzantium, now called Constantinople in his honour. He built a huge church there, the Hagia Irene, the Holy Peace. Christianity was now very definitely on the map and even had its own capital city. Constantine took an interest in church matters from early on, and it seems he was dismayed to discover that this new faith that he had embraced was actually very divided. It was uncertain what it believed. It was riven by the Arian heresy. And so he decided that there was only one thing to do, and that was actually to have a general council of the church to actually decide what was right. And so in 325, he called the council at Nicaea with the intention of sorting all this out. For the first time, the Christian faith was being directly influenced by imperial power. Christianity was not yet the official religion of the empire, and some of Constantine's successors followed the Arian heresy. One Roman emperor, Julian, turned his back on Christianity altogether and returned to the pagan gods, but the direction was now clearly set. And in 380, Emperor Theodosius I made Nicene Christianity the official state religion, effectively outlawing paganism. From now onwards, to be on the wrong side of Christianity was to invite persecution and imprisonment, and pagans were imprisoned, persecuted, and murdered. What did all this mean for the Christian church? Well, it gave church leaders legally recognised authority and influence. The leading church bishop, the Pope in Rome, acquired more power and influence, eventually becoming an effective ruler in his own right, especially with the emperor now residing in Constantinople. The church could now invest in building churches that were not at risk of being pulled down. And so over the next century, beautiful basilicas were built, some of which in Ravenna and elsewhere still stand. Christianity now dominated the city landscape in the way that Roman temples had once done. The big change was that church membership increased massively. It was now disadvantageous not to be a Christian, and so many of the wealthy Roman classes now converted. And of course, many of these now became bishops in the same way that previous generations would have sought to become legislators and senators. Martyrdom was ended. And that, of course, is a good thing. But for many Christians brought up on 300 years of persecution and tales of martyrdom, it was disorientating. They had learnt to honour the martyrs and even to seek martyrdom themselves. Now being a Christian was a mark of social status, not dishonour. And so for many, martyrdom was sought out in other ways. They would escape the cities, escape the churches. They'd form ascetic monasteries. They'd become hermits. And so there was now an official church residing in places like Rome and Constantinople, but an unofficial church living on the margins. So was it a good or a bad thing? Well, if you're arguing that it was a good thing, you would say that Europe and then ultimately the world could surely never have been evangelized in the way that it was without the power of empire behind it. The flourishing of Christian liturgy and architecture bringing glory to God was a direct result of Roman patronage. Without the power and the status of the Roman state, Christianity could easily now be remembered alongside Mithraism and Manichaeism as one of the exotic cults of the later Roman Empire. But if you were going to argue the other way, you would see that Christianity had now lost its innocence and arguably its prophetic edge. It became gentrified and increasingly intolerant. The church leadership, despite many exceptional examples, became increasingly tainted by the desire for social status and gain. Christianity became inextricably linked up with politics, with profound implications that are still being felt centuries later. Think of Donald Trump standing outside of a church holding a Bible aloft, or the support of the Russian Orthodox Church for the repressive measures of President Putin. For better, for worse, the conversion of Constantine meant that Christianity, then as now, found itself both in the margins of human society and at the very heart of the establishment, something which causes perpetual internal wrestling.